So welcome to the enterprise-wide employee well-being webinar. The vision of the employee well-being team is to create the culture and environment where our employees feel supported in all aspects of their work and life, allowing our people to do their best work. And in order to best support you, a listening strategy has been our top priority. So you will receive a brief survey to get your feedback on today's webinar, along with any other recommendations you have on future webinar topics you'd like to see or other resources to foster employee well-being here at Mayo Clinic. Based on previous webinar surveys, employees have suggested topics on parenting and the importance of staff recognition. And so today, Jody Nation is speaking on calm and confident parenting. And on April 20th, Pam Glassley will be speaking on the importance of staff recognition and the resources available to show appreciation to staff here at Mayo Clinic. In addition, it's important to the Mayo Clinic employee wellbeing team that we foster the Mayo Clinic values through our resources such as this webinar, especially fostering compassion and healing to our employees during this challenging time. And so I'm so thankful to have Jody Nation presenting today on calm and confident parenting. Jody is a licensed professional clinical counselor and works in the Mayo Clinic Rochester Employee Assistance Program. Jody assists employees with concerns that impact their well-being, including mental health, relationships, work issues, and parenting. Welcome, Jody. So glad you could be with us.
Thanks, and thank you for that nice introduction. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. And I'd like to start by asking a quick poll question about how confident are you in your ability to parent calmly? Just please go ahead and answer that honestly. I just kind of want to gauge where my audience is at. And I was sharing with Bridget prior to starting this, I usually don't get very nervous doing these kinds of presentations, but for this one, I'm a little bit more nervous, and I'll tell you why. It's because I think parenting is so important and we're so hard on ourselves as parents. And so one of the things, if I leave you with nothing else today, I want you to know that you're doing great. And because as long as we're trying as parents, as long as we're responding and growing and seeing what we can do to adjust and what works, you're succeeding. And so I really just encourage you to keep that in mind. And also the other thing I want to do is kind of recognize that parenting is not one size fits all. There's going to be things that we're going to talk about today that may work beautifully for some of you and may fall flat for others. And that's okay, because it's part of figuring out what works for you, your child, and your family, and how that fits in best. And I know Bridget kind of gave a little bit of an overview about my background in terms of my counseling and what I do in the EAP program. But I wanted to take a brief moment and just share a little bit of my background in terms of experience with kids and where that comes from. So I'm the mom of two boys who just both had birthdays in this last month. So I have a 3- and a 6-year-old now. I also did my internship when I was doing my training in play therapy and did in-home trauma-focused family therapy for children who'd witnessed violence. And I also did day treatment for many years, working with 11 to 19-year-olds with severe emotional disturbances or behavioral disturbances. And then I also worked in a career development program with at-risk youth ages kind of 14 to 21. So kind of a variety of experiences there. I just wanted to kind of give you a background when I'm going through some of these things that I'm talking about. And I am certainly not a perfect parent myself. I'm going to share some of my parenting fails or parenting mistakes with you today. And invite hopefully lots of creativity and ideas, how we can all go forward and how we can all parent more calmly and confidently. So would you go ahead and share those results in terms of where everybody is at? I'm not sure if everyone can see this, but so kind of where most of us are in that somewhat confident range in terms of 74%. We've got a little on either end of the spectrum, so we'll hopefully help make a improvement on that as we go through today. So now kind of moving on to our objectives. I'm going to ask another poll question in here quickly just to help me as I'm giving some examples. I'm not going to read through all of those learning objectives, but what age group do your children fall in? If you could share that with me, that would help as I give examples in each of these, just to kind of see the range of parents we're meeting with today as a group. Looks like we're getting close to everybody responding. Just give it another couple seconds here. Appreciate your patience with getting that through. All right, so we've got really interesting kind of 20% in most, but I see a lot of us in those 3 to 5 age and a lot in 8 to 11. So thank you for sharing that with me. So that as we go, again, I'm going to try to give examples for every age group, recognizing that we have different approaches as our kids reach different ages. So our first objective here is to differentiate between reactive and proactive parenting strategies and learn to hopefully implement some more proactive strategies. So I want to kind of start by just going over what is the difference between reactive and proactive parenting. So in a reactive, it's often an emotional response, right? We're kind of reacting to that stimulus really quickly. It's kind of that snap, here I'm responding. A lot of times it's kind of like that stop. If you think of really like loud or sudden, really trying to get whatever the behavior is to basically stop. And what this can do is can sometimes produce feelings of guilt or shame because we're often not happy with how we handled that situation. Or sometimes we feel like, gosh, that was really overreactive, maybe at times, or it escalates a situation. And again, when we think about it in review, we're often not happy with it. The other thing with reactive parenting is it tends to assume the worst, meaning we tend to somehow assign that our child is purposely doing something to embarrass us, or they're purposely kind of being defiant or acting out, or that they've somehow kind of sabotaged something good that we were trying to do, or that they're making bad choices solely just kind of to be bad, so to speak. And again, trying to not separate with reactive parenting, it doesn't always look at the separation of the behavior versus kind of the choice. Where proactive parenting is really trying to build in a pause before responding. So taking a moment kind of to take that deep breath or that second and just process what's happening. And it aims to alter situations by kind of pre-planning and being ahead on things. There's often planned transitions with proactive parenting where we're letting our kids know what's coming next. And this is especially with younger children, like talking about what's happening next so that it's not a surprise, that it's not an abrupt ending. And with proactive parenting, a lot of times we're really creative in our response, and it gives the benefit of the doubt, meaning we don't always assume the worst of our children's behavior. A lot of times we give them the benefit of the doubt for whatever the behavior is. So I'm just curious kind of where everyone would say that you fit in terms of this poll question, where you identify as. And as I'm waiting for that to come in, I kind of want to share a couple of examples versus reactive versus proactive. And one area that I think a lot of people struggle with is either kind of morning routines or bedtime routines. And, reactive parenting is, getting frustrated. Come on, I said we have to get to bed, we have to get out the door, kind of running around, where's the shoes, where's the toothbrush, and feeling like we didn't necessarily leave our children the way that we wanted to on any given day. Where the proactive parenting, maybe that's the night before all the clothes are picked out and laid out, or maybe you have a cushion that you give yourself in the morning to get out the door. I'll never forget one of my first personal experiences with reactive parenting came back when I had to ride a commuter bus, and some of us remember those days. And obviously, if you're a minute late, the bus is gone. And I remember trying to put my toddler at the time into the car seat and him doing the kind of back bracing. If any of you are at that stage or have been through that stage where they arch their back and they stiff out their body and they make it almost impossible for you to buckle them in. And I remember just being exasperated and saying, you're going to make me late, right? And I was so embarrassed afterwards because I thought I just told a 2-year-old he's going to make me late. He's purposely not trying to sabotage my day or make me miss my bus. But it was very not a pleasant experience for either one of us. And the reason I share that is that was a simple one to identify as reactive and move to proactive. For me, it was a simple fix in terms of, all right, 5 minutes earlier, 10 minutes earlier, getting up really avoids those situations and makes our mornings a lot less chaotic. So that's one kind of example. I'm looking at the poll results here, and it looks like most of us say that we're somewhere in between today, about 46%. And I love this answer because I can identify with that. Depends on the day, about 32% in there. And again, a little bit of smattering in between there with reactive and proactive. So again, thanks for sharing that just so that I can see kind of where everybody's at as we go through this. I see that there are some hands raised, and I will get to Q&A here at the end. And I appreciate that I have some people helping me monitor the chat, because I am going to invite you to share some things in the chat with each other. But one thing I'm not good at is reading and so I'm not going to look at any to rely on kind of our well-being support people here to help with that, and at the end get to any questions. And so if there are things that you've learned that are really good proactive tips that you'd like to share with each other in the chat as I'm talking about how you increase proactive skills, please feel free to do so. I like to keep these as interactive as we can within the confines of a webinar. So increasing proactive skills, really planning ahead. That can be one of the biggest things, is anticipating what might go wrong with this and having a plan to deal with that. And I think about, obviously, morning and bedtime routines are pretty straightforward examples with young children, but something that you might think of too in terms of teenagers and such is like curfew violations, like what's going to happen if someone's late, thinking through and having a plan for that, so it's not a reactive off the cuff in the moment. Because one thing that's important for kids is consistency and to know what to expect. If they misbehave once, does that result in a timeout? Does it result in a toy being taken away? Does it result in some type of privilege? And do they know what those consequences and expectations are? And that's how sometimes planning ahead and having agreements can really be helpful. Also trying to assume the best or give our children the benefit of the doubt, meaning I know if it's getting closer to nap time, for example, I might be a little bit easier or more patient in my responses because I'm giving my child the benefit of the doubt that they're kind of reaching their end. But sometimes we don't give our kids that same kind of grace that we give ourselves or others, meaning knowing sometimes right when we get home, maybe we're not our best version of selves as we're having that transition from work to home. And we're kind of conscious of that as we kind of need a moment to unwind. But our kids also have been on their best behavior, maybe at daycare or at school all day, and maybe they need that transition too. And really trying to assume the best of intent. Also considering your child's viewpoint. What does this look like for them in terms of, is it unfair? Is it not? Is it something that they weren't anticipating and it disrupts something they enjoyed? It doesn't mean that you're going to change that or cater to their whim, but validating feelings and kind of communicating with that understanding can be really helpful. Whenever you can, create opportunities for choice, and sometimes I say, pick two choices you're comfortable with. So if it's something as simple as snack, or is it something as simple as, choosing an activity, or, what order we're going to do things in, or maybe it's, what you're going to wear today. Again, providing choices that you're comfortable with. Also really work to separate the behavior from the person. So meaning we don't want to say you're bad. We're going to say, that choice isn't a great choice, or that behavior is separate from the person, so that they don't kind of develop an internal self-dialogue that's really overly negative. And I like this, when my son was probably around 2, he started telling his dog, you better start making better choices, Bruno, or you're going to end up on timeout. And it was really cute to me that he started to understand that choices have consequences, and we have expectations of our behavior. Also really learn to pause and breathe with proactive skills, meaning sometimes it's okay to say, oh, I can't even look at that situation right now. If there's not imminent danger or harm, maybe you need to walk into the other room for a moment and think through, okay, how do I want to respond to this? Or how do I want to handle this? Or if your teenager, has really poor grades and you get the email from the teacher, it's probably not best to call them into the room right then and there. And maybe makes sense to really process it and think about, okay, how do I want to address this with him or her? What do I want to talk to them about? And what am I leaning towards in terms of expectations, or if there is a consequence? But really just taking that moment and giving yourself permission to pause and process it. So kind of the next level of proactive skills are to empathize and really make sure that we're validating those feelings. Something that I was guilty of myself, my kindergartner unfortunately already doesn't like school. And he would tell me, it's so boring, I don't want to go. And my first reaction, and I know this is bad, especially since I'm a counselor, I would say, oh, no, it's not. It'll be so much fun. You're going to love being with your friends and all the cool things you're going to get to do. But I wasn't validating anything that he said. And that doesn't mean that I need to agree with him. But now my approach is a little bit different. If he tells me that in the morning, that it's oh so boring, I say, yeah, it's really hard to go somewhere where you feel like you're going to be bored all day, right? I just acknowledge and validate it. Doesn't mean I agree, but I say that. And usually what that does is quickly transitions to, well, what could I do if I'm bored? What would help me if that boredom does happen? And I've noticed that it's kind of shortened those conversations. And he actually hasn't said that to me for quite some time. And I think it's because he feels heard. And thinking about how am I empathizing with my child? Again, good listening does not equal agreement. And so just validating where you can, that you understand where they're coming from. Also thinking about your child's strengths and making sure that you're playing to those strengths or utilizing them when you can. And really, I noticed in the chat comment earlier when people were sharing their parenting tips, a lot of it was about catch your kids being good, comment on the positive. This is very similar in concept. Also work to avoid strings of commands. This is something that I think, especially like if we're trying to kind of move from one activity to the next, it might be, all right, pick up your toys, put on your shoes, grab this, right? So really resisting the urge to give those string of commands, but really slow down and choose one thing at a time. Invite cooperation when it's appropriate. So, and I say cooperation and collaboration, right? Like teenagers, especially, I always say whenever possible, especially when you're being proactive, talk about, okay, what's going to be the consequence or expectations for using the car as an example, or what will happen if you're late, or if something happens with the cell phone being used inappropriately, or whatever it might be. Invite them into deciding what's appropriate and kind of have either a written or verbal contract together about what that looks like. All of those things can be really, really helpful. So I'm going to move on to the second objective, and that's to understand the importance of connection in parenting. And while I read these quotes here, I'm going to invite a poll question. But I like these two quotes in terms of thinking about what does it mean to connect? And rules without relationship lead to rebellion. I think is so powerful because we really have to focus on that connection first. And that does not mean that I'm encouraging any of you to not have expectations or to be too easy on your children or anything like that. I think structure, routine, expectations, boundaries are all very important parts of parenting. But we have to have that relationship in order to make those rules make sense and to make them want to follow the rules. And I like this other piece about you have to reach the heart before you can reach the head. In the sense of really what is most important to you. And that's, again, connecting with your child. And I put up this quick poll just because I wanted to see how people kind of felt about their ability to connect with their children. It looks like a lot of people fall in that sometimes category of 64%, which I think is pretty normal because, again, we all, especially, at different periods in their life, I think teenagers are especially a challenge, or even as kids are gaining more independence and changing, all of those things can make us question, are we still connecting on the same level? Or if maybe, interests change and you find it's harder to relate or identify with, all of those can lead to thinking more about connection. And I would again invite you in the chat if you would like to share kind of some of the best parenting kind of tips or tricks you've learned to connect, you certainly can. And I noticed at the beginning that many of you had shared kind of one of my favorite, which is one-on-one time, really making that a priority of how do I have that time to connect. And I noticed one of someone else had wrote to really listen with undivided attention. And I think that's so important because you want your child to feel like what they have to say is important to you and not just kind of, a peripheral thought. Again, that empathizing, I can't stress that enough. It doesn't mean that you necessarily agree with point of view, but really letting them know that you understand point of view. Also offering comfort. And that might look very different depending on your child's personality and depending on their age. I have, as I said, my 3-year-old, he just turned 3 not even a month ago. And one of the things, if he is having somewhat of a meltdown, something that's really powerful for him is just for me to ask if he wants a hug. I would say 9 out of 10 times he says yes, and he just comes and gives me a hug, and his breathing slows down and the crying subsides. And before we know it, we're back to what we're doing. And sometimes he says no, and that's okay. And I've read different parenting strategies about even, sitting there, just being close to your child, not saying or doing anything can be powerful because you're showing them that I can be there with you even when it's hard. And now that's not to say sometimes, as we've all heard and been taught, I'm sure, to walk away. Some children really like their space and just need a little bit of time alone. My 6-year-old has said that to me actually, like, Mom, I just need a minute by myself. Great. I'm glad you can communicate what you need and I can give you that space. So offering comfort though, for a teenager, if you know that they're having, maybe that school is really hard, or maybe they're dealing with a relationship issue of their own, whether that be a friendship or a dating relationship, sometimes saying, that's really tough. Do you want to do something for distraction? Do you want to go catch a movie? Do you want to go on a walk and talk about it? Really just offering that I'm here in any way that I can to provide comfort. Something that I did a lot in day treatment with my youth, and this was before kind of adult coloring books were popular. This was probably close to 20 years ago already. But for some of them, if they were upset, they'd like to sit down and color. And, so even thinking about like your, kind of elementary age students, is that something you can do, is to say like, hey, can I just sit down and do this with you, or be close to you while you're reading a book? Those things can all be helpful. Also recognizing a child's desire to feel needed. Again, early on, before we kind of started the talk, I noticed some people were writing about letting kids help with chores, which is an important life skill, but also it helps them to feel important and needed. And so finding, how can I involve them in life? How do I make them feel like they're a part of this family and an important part of this family that keeps everything running, that we're a team. So thinking about all of those things can also be helpful. Make sure that you're modeling respect, just like you would want to be given respect, and really think about, how does this sound? And sometimes with young kids, it's about, getting down to eye level so that there's not that seeming kind of loomingness that can be from adults or bigger people, but also to think about, with teens, like, I want to hear your input on this. It doesn't mean that I'm going to agree with you, but I'd like to hear your input on how you think this should be handled. And really, again, listening without judgment or the idea that I'm going to refute everything you say, but just really listening for understanding. Also focusing on solutions, like, hey, what we're doing isn't working. We don't necessarily need to sit and dwell on why the behavior is so wrong, unless you feel like that's not understood, then that might be part of it. But like with my boys, for example, and I don't know how many of you here have siblings close in age, but it can be quite the wrestling party at my house at times. And clearly I don't want that going where one of them is going to get hurt. So what's the solution? Sometimes for us, the solution is, let's do something else to get out that energy. So sometimes, this winter especially, we set up a trampoline, like one of those little indoor ones in one of the upstairs bedrooms. They could get some energy off in there. We kind of took everything off the walls and we had Nerf football. They played catch up in there because it was too cold to really be outside. That was part of our solution for getting some of that energy out. For my older child, we've done sometimes a behavioral contract in crayon even, about, okay, this is what's going to happen if you hit your brother. And my son's love is Kindle. He loves his Kindle. So that's an easy thing, and letting him be involved in that. But again, focusing on, what's our solution to this? That we have to work together and have some cooperation about that when possible. Understand that I want you to do age appropriate here. It doesn't always make sense to invite a child into that discussion. Sometimes it's more important to be clear and concise with your expectations. But again, focusing on that solution instead of the lecture. And have expectations, but be willing to examine if they are realistic, and understanding that kids are different. It might be for one child, expecting that they get straight A's in school is very realistic. For another child, it might be realistic to expect C's and be really happy when there's something above that. And really taking the time to think about individually, what are my kids' needs and how do I adjust and adapt to those? The other thing that I think about connection, that I like to really share with everyone, and I think this can be true no matter what the age of your child is ask them to teach you. Even if it's something you know how to do, let them teach you about it. So if your child is playing, with a pretend kitchen, oh, teach me how you're making that. If your teenager, as they're probably much more technologically advanced than most of us, ask them to teach you about a game that they're into, or about a TikTok person that they follow, or a YouTube channel that they really think is cool. Invite them to teach you, whether that's a game or, again, how they set something up. That can be very powerful in terms of connection. And one tip I really like to share with parents of teenagers is look for opportunities where you don't have to have direct eye contact. You're probably going to have some of your best conversations either walking or driving in the car. because it's much easier to open up then. So to create those opportunities can be a really powerful way to connect. I also like to share this kind of concept with you, just food for thought, in terms of the most important minutes of your child's day. So really think about, what's my experience with my child when they first wake up, about when they come home from daycare, school, or work, and then the last 3 minutes before they go to bed. Thinking about, again, that idea of, a lot of times our parents are what becomes our internal voice, and what kind of voice are we providing our kids with? So we're going to move on to objective number 3, and this is to increase our own ability to self-regulate in stressful situations. And kind of just thinking about this in terms of expectations and how we're doing this. I really encourage you all just to think of this as a little bit of a gut check, and there's no judgment associated with this whatsoever, but really think about, how am I doing kind of in my own self-care and my ability to self-regulate? And to think about, if I can't self-regulate, if I can't demonstrate that, how can I expect my child to? And really think about, how am I teaching them what that looks like? I've had adults come to me in a counseling situation, especially, in relationship situations, and say, I don't know how to fight. Like, I don't know how to argue. That just never happened in my house. Or I don't know how to do it without it becoming ugly. Thinking about, what are we modeling? And I think about the same kind of piece with self-regulation. If any of you have seen those glitter bottles, where they shake them up and you use that to kind of calm down as a way, or have done deep breathing. I know in my son's preschool, they taught them star breathing and different things like that. In my house, sometimes this is where we'll use like a dance it out kind of thing, if it feels like we need to kind of change our attitude or change our mood, trying to do humor in that, but letting my kids see, what does mom do to do that? What does dad do to do that? And watching them learn and pick up on that language about how to do that. And a key to improving self-regulation, especially with kids, is to really take the time to plan ahead, right? To be proactive. So these are some more tips for self-regulation, to practice good self-care, having that all of the time, to recognize your triggers and when you're ramping up. So if you know that you can feel your neck getting hot because, your kids won't stop arguing or fighting, or you feel your heart racing a little bit, knowing what those are can help you to kind of take a moment and say, okay, do I need to take a moment and, just step into another room for a minute? Do I need to take a couple deep breaths before I address this? Do I need to rely on, if I have a behavioral chart I'm using, or some type of agreement with my child on behavior, or something that I'm going to say, like, this is a warning, and then I'm going to follow through on whatever consequence that is. But really thinking about, how do I recognize that for myself? And you can also utilize in the moment strategies, whether that be deep breathing or reciting a mantra, if you need to exit the situation. Personally, I'm a big fan of trying to find humor. And if I get my kids to giggle and laugh with me, that usually, again, changes kind of attitude around. So thinking about what works for you. And if you're not sure what works for you, that's okay. That can be a time to experiment and say, well, this week I think I'm going to try this. And I'm going to really evaluate and reflect. Was that helpful? Was it not? If it wasn't, what are some other ideas that I could try? And again, these are opportunities, I think, a lot of times to include children and start to teach them some of these self-regulation tips as well, so that they can learn to rely on them. Also, really naming your feelings and learning how to process and handle those feelings can be helpful. And I think this has to do with having a vocabulary to name what you're saying. I don't know if any of you live kind of in the country now or from a farm, but something kind of funny that had happened was my 2-year-old had come in and he was so upset because he had a burdock stuck on his glove. And he was like, Mom, I'm just so mad. I'm just so upset, he goes, because he had this little thing sticking on his glove that he couldn't get off. And I thought, wow, for a 2-year-old, he's got more kind of range of vocabulary to say what he's feeling. But then to figure out, what do I do with that, right? And so sometimes being kind of in tune and in touch with our feelings, and maybe it's not even that we're upset with our kids. Maybe we had a really rough day at work, or maybe we're, having a problem with one of our own friends or our partner or somebody else. And sometimes anger comes out sideways. That's something that I just talked to a young man about not that long ago in a session where kind of in his first dating relationship, and he talked about how anxious he is about screwing up, and that he noticed what's been happening as he's been shorter with his parents and his siblings because he doesn't really have anything to do with this anxiety that's kind of bubbling over. And so I think finding a way to recognize that for ourselves, being self-aware, and then helping our kids with that vocabulary and identification so that they can also then transition to, okay, this is what I'm feeling. That's okay. I'm going to acknowledge it. Now, what am I going to do to move forward with it? Can be, again, a powerful tool. And the other thing with self-regulation that I'd like to say is this is also a time to model repair. And what I mean by that is, let's say you do lose your cool, and maybe you yell and you feel bad about that, or you maybe react in a harsher way, like with a consequence that doesn't necessarily fit the crime, so to speak. And after you've had a moment to reflect about it, you decide, I don't like the way I handled that. It's a perfect opportunity to go forward, to go back to your child and apologize and say, you know what, mom doesn't like the way she handled that. I'm really sorry that I yelled. I want to do better. This is what I'm going to try instead. So again, it's not just the words or the apology, but it's kind of following through with the action. What am I going to do better next time? And modeling that so that your child can also learn it's okay for me to not do things perfectly. I will figure out what to do with it from there. So I'm going to move on to the idea of self-compassion, which kind of in a way piggybacks nicely off of the idea of self-regulation. And I think self-compassion as a parent is so important because, again, we're often our own worst critics and we kind of beat ourselves up for many different things. And it's important for your own emotional health and well-being to be self-compassionate, but also to model that for your kids so that they can learn to do that. So what is self-compassion? One of the kind of components of self-compassion is the ability to actively soothe yourself, and that is free from judgment. So meaning like, I'm kind of feeling really angry or frustrated or, just overwhelmed with being a parent today. It's not about judging like, oh, you should never feel that way. Your kids are a blessing, right? And those things can be true. But when we say things like that in the moment, it often produces shame and guilt. It's not a helpful kind of feeling. So the idea is to be able to really say like, okay, I'm feeling overwhelmed. I'm feeling flooded with emotion. What am I going to do about that to take care of me right now and not have that judgment associated? And we're also going to recognize that imperfection is a universal human experience, meaning none of us are perfect. We're all going to have moments. And I think also not making things about us or tying children's stuff into a failure, into our own failure. I'll share a quick embarrassing story that actually happened to me on Easter. My 3-year-old, very loudly, and I will give a little bit of background here. He has been in speech therapy before, so not everything is always clear, but this did come out clear as day. He called one of his cousins a dumb, and I'll let you fill in the blank. And I was mortified, as all my aunts and uncles are looking on and turn to look at me about what to do. And in the moment, it's almost like you're froze, but part of me is like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. So I picked him up and removed him from the situation. And again, talk about words and a proactive strategy now for if he uses a word that's not okay. Unfortunately, some older cousins thought it was kind of funny to get him to say some things that he shouldn't. But the idea is recognizing that I'm not a perfect parent. My children are not going to behave perfectly. I might not have responded the best in a certain situation the way I wanted to, and that's okay. And also kind of transitioning into being self-aware, mindful of your experiences. What is it that I'm enjoying about this? Am I able to really live in the moment? And the underlying premise is that mistakes are a teacher, and they're not something that needs to be avoided at all costs. And again, I think this is important to model for your children as well, because we want them to know that if they make a mistake or something that they don't see themselves as a failure, but that they see it as, this is perfectly acceptable. What did I learn from this? And how do I move forward? And kind of making mistakes doesn't mean that you excuse what you did or say, oh, that's okay. I didn't intend to hurt his feelings, so I should just be excused. No, that's where making repairs can be important, but it's being just aware of the fact that I can't hold myself to an unattainable standard, or I'm always going to kind of beat myself up about that. So I thank you all for filling out that poll. It looks like most of us are feeling like we sometimes do a good job, kind of in that 84% category, which I think is fairly typical, meaning that, we're usually, depending on the situation and probably depending on our own resources internally that day, we might do better at it. So thinking again about, for those of you who kind of checked always, if you want to share any of your kind of pro tips in the chat for self-compassion, please feel free to do that. And again, to think about, what does this look like for me and how am I modeling it for my kids? So self-compassion in action, really grant permission to yourself to be imperfect and accept that there may be pain, that, I might feel bad about this, and that's okay. Self-compassion does not excuse poor choices. Again, this is where it gets back to the idea of modeling repair. So what am I doing to kind of make amends for this? And then again, to change the outcome next time. And this kind of model of self-compassion fitting with proactive and reactive parenting, I think, is helpful, because a lot of times we're saying, you know what, I didn't handle a parenting situation the best, or maybe you had an older child that something worked amazingly well with, but then with your younger child, you're finding it's falling flat. So self-compassion allows you to say, you know what, that's okay, but it's kind of encouraging you to then go to those proactive strategies and say, okay, what am I going to do different? What am I going to try? And really treating things, I think, as an experiment, so that, okay, if this doesn't go as well as I'd like to, we can come back to the drawing board as a family, as a team with my child, or trying some things out on my own that I'll introduce. Also monitoring negative self-talk in terms of really being self-compassionate. And so for those of you who might not know what negative self-talk is, it's really that internal dialogue that we hear. And unfortunately, as a parent, sometimes I think it's like, oh, you're a terrible parent, you're failing your child, you're not setting them up for success, you're not doing what they need, you don't spend enough time with them, you're, X, Y, and Z, right? And it snowballs. It can get very, very large, very, very quickly. So the idea of monitoring negative self-talk sometimes is kind of trying to take a pause and saying, okay, if I have that thought, like I'm not being a good parent, what's a different way? What's a more helpful way I could look at that? Maybe it might be telling myself something like, I didn't handle that situation the way I wanted to, but I have a plan to do better next time. Or I'm going to try to learn some other strategies that I could see if they work better, right? So it's about trying to kind of keep it from snowballing and not being hypercritical of yourself. Because chances are, if you were to talk to one of your friends, another parent about a situation, they're going to be much more kind of uplifting and supportive of you than you are of yourself. Sometimes developing a mindfulness practice, such as meditation, can be really helpful in terms of self-compassion. And also this idea of, how would you treat a treasured friend? Meaning, what kind of messages would you be giving them? What kind of expectations would you have for them? Really thinking about that concept when you're trying to demonstrate self-compassion for yourself. And then again, trying to teach your child that this is an inner dialogue that's helpful. We can recognize when we haven't succeeded or done something in the way that we want to. We can then make adjustments, but it doesn't make sense to continually beat ourselves up for that and have the cycle of guilt or shame. So I want to share some resources with all of you. The first is the Employee Assistance Program, which is where I'm from. And for those of you in the enterprise, that number is up as well for you to connect with your EAP. If there's something really specific you want to talk about that's going on with your child, or bounce some ideas off of someone, please feel free to meet with a counselor. The Employee Wellbeing website has a plethora of resources. There's a couple books I wanted to share, Peaceful Parent, Happy Kids, and No Drama Discipline. And the No Drama Discipline, one thing that I really enjoyed about that is both authors shared some of the times where they didn't parent the way that they had wanted to, but really kind of the idea behind the principle behind the book is really to connect and to not react in the moment when a child is too kind of emotional to really receive the messages either. Really thinking about, how do I use what we know about brains and brain science to really respond in a much calmer way. So that's part of where I got some of the things that I talked about today from. But one of the things that I'd like to put up a poll about is, how interested are you in participating in a parenting support group? We're just at this point gauging interest, but I'd like to see kind of where people are at in that, because it's something we've thought about offering in the future. I'd also at this time really like you to invite you to share any resources as a parent that you found helpful, whether that be a book, a podcast, a website, a certain blog. If there's something that you found really helpful, please feel free to share that in the chat, because I know that the transcripts of the chat can go out with the slide deck after the presentation, just to give you an opportunity to learn from other parents about what resources are helpful. And I think some of this too is kind of dependent on what you're dealing with as a parent. Some of you may have, a child with ADHD, and that might warrant some real specific strategies. Or some of you might have what is now kind of the popular term, a spirited child. They used to call them strong-willed child or a spirited child. And again, recognizing that this is not a one-size-all fits approach. So I really hope that that's a message that all of you can take from today. I'm going to kind of